The notice arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, tucked neatly into the homeowner's mailbox, wrapped in the standard HOA-branded envelope that always carried an air of unwelcome authority. The homeowner, who had lived in the community for 5 steady years without incident, opened the letter assuming it was another generic newsletter filled with gardening reminders and community potluck dates. But the moment the new fee schedule slipped out, neatly printed and aggressively highlighted, everything seemed to shift. The document outlined a sudden increase in monthly dues, justified under a category labeled sidewalk, wear and tear assessment. The phrase alone felt wrong. The homeowner lived on the outer loop of the community, a section intentionally built without sidewalks to preserve what the developers once called a more natural aesthetic. The absence of concrete walkways had actually been part of the appeal during the initial purchase, a subtle promise of privacy and space. So reading that the HOA had charged him an additional amount for something that did not exist, not on his property, not on his street, and not anywhere within several hundred feet of his home, sparked a wave of confusion that soon solidified into suspicion. At first, the homeowner considered the possibility of a clerical error. HOAs were not immune to mistakes. In fact, their reputation often relied on a rotating board of volunteers who made decisions with more enthusiasm than expertise. But the more he examined the letter, the more deliberate the fee appeared. The wording carried no uncertainty, no conditional phrasing, no hint that the assessment was optional or even new. It stated flatly that the board had reviewed infrastructure erosion and determined that homes within the community must collectively pay for ongoing sidewalk maintenance. There was no breakdown, no map, and no explanation for how the costs had been calculated. The homeowner folded the paper and placed it on the kitchen table, where it sat like a challenge. Though he was not a confrontational person, he knew when something didn't make sense, and this assessment crossed the line from confusing to absurd. After a few minutes of pacing, he retrieved the letter, sat at his computer, and began researching past HOA budgets. Over the years, he had kept digital archives of all notices and meeting minutes, partly out of habit and partly out of mild distrust. When he compared this new fee to previous statements, he noticed subtle changes. Small increases listed under vague categories, quietly introduced without any community vote. The realization deepened as he scanned old documents. The HOA had been adding minor charges for months, tiny enough to seem insignificant individually but noticeable when stacked together. Landscaping adjustments, community enhancement surcharges, exterior inspection expansions, and now sidewalk wear. Each new item seemed intentionally broad, a catch-all phrase that allowed the board to add charges without scrutiny. Yet none were as blatantly incorrect as this sidewalk fee. With growing concern, the homeowner took a slow walk down his street, observing each property. Not one home had a sidewalk. The entire stretch of road curved gently through a wooded perimeter, bordered by grass and gravel, not concrete slabs. There was simply nothing to maintain, nothing to repair, and certainly nothing to justify extra fees. He took photos of the roadside and the empty grass strips, documenting what was obvious to anyone who lived there. The HOA's explanation simply didn't match reality. By the time he returned home, the confusion had evolved into curiosity. Curiosity then morphed into determination. He retrieved every HOA document he owned and spread them across the table, each page offering a piece of a puzzle that seemed to stretch beyond his single assessment. The more he compared numbers, the more anomalies he found. Yearly projections fluctuated without correlation to actual expenses. Repair funds seemed overestimated while the corresponding work either never occurred or appeared minimal. What was presented as infrastructure improvement often remained unchanged, with vague project statuses mentioned only in passing. This pattern hinted at mismanagement at best and intentional misbilling at worst. It was difficult to tell where incompetence ended and exploitation began. Though the homeowner wasn't yet ready to accuse anyone, he couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. The sidewalk fee had merely been the spark. Now the broader fire was becoming visible. When he finally looked up from the paperwork, evening had settled in. The sky outside was dimming, and a familiar stillness had spread across the neighborhood, interrupted only by the distant hum of passing cars. The community looked peaceful from the outside, but the homeowner now recognized an undercurrent of something else. Something inaccurately recorded, quietly hidden, or deliberately skewed. The HOA had been operating with a confidence that suggested nobody had been paying close attention. But now, for the first time, someone was. That night, the homeowner made a plan. First, he would gather more data. He wanted clarity, accuracy, and proof. There were official records available, publicly accessible, and he knew exactly where to find them. The county's online database contained everything from property maps to infrastructure logs. If sidewalks existed anywhere near his property, the county records would show them. If the HOA's budget had been filed correctly, discrepancies would appear within the reports. And if there was a pattern of overcharging within the community, he would soon uncover it. He pulled up the county's GIS mapping system, entering his address and zooming in on the aerial layout. Every line, every path, every label was clear. His street had no sidewalk designation whatsoever, nor did the several surrounding streets. Only the central part of the community, several blocks away, contained sidewalks, and even those appeared weathered but intact. Yet those homeowners were being charged the same amount as him, and many of them lived nowhere near the affected areas. This discovery shifted the narrative from isolated error to community-wide issue. What had been a personal concern suddenly felt systemic. If dozens of homeowners were paying for something they didn't have, the total pool of excess funds could be substantial. The numbers hinted at misallocation or worse, deliberate misdirection. The homeowner saved screenshots, exported maps, organized files, and prepared a comprehensive folder. He wanted to approach the situation calmly and rationally, equipped with facts rather than assumptions. But beneath the organization and preparation, a quiet sense of injustice simmered. He had paid dues faithfully for years, trusting the HOA to manage the community responsibly. Now that trust felt misplaced. Before going to bed, he drafted a detailed report outlining the inconsistencies. It wasn't meant for immediate submission. It was simply the foundation of what he suspected would become a larger investigation. He knew that presenting the findings to the HOA board would result in pushback. He anticipated deflection, excuses, perhaps even condescension. HOAs rarely admitted to mistakes without pressure. But he was ready, or at least he was becoming ready. As he closed his laptop, he felt a new sense of resolve. The sidewalk fee was no longer just a confusing charge. It was a symbol of something deeper, something that had likely been occurring for far longer than anyone realized. And now that the truth had begun to surface, he understood that uncovering the full scope would require persistence. The first cracks in the foundation had appeared. The real break was still ahead. The morning after compiling his findings, the homeowner woke with a clarity that felt almost foreign. For years, he had moved through the rhythms of the neighborhood without questioning much of anything. The HOA was simply part of the environment, irritating at times, overbearing at others, but ultimately a fixture that governed the community's order. Now, that perception had shifted. The HOA no longer appeared as an administrative body but as a structure woven together by complacency, secrecy, and unquestioned authority. The sidewalk fee had peeled back a corner of the facade, and he intended to lift it further. He started by expanding his research into areas that, until then, he had never considered relevant. Property assessments, community improvement logs, and expenditure filings became his morning reading. These documents weren't meant to be accessible in any intuitive sense. They were labyrinthine in structure, plagued with jargon and deliberately vague categories. Yet as he sifted through them, he noticed patterns that repeated in quiet regularity. Entries that theoretically accounted for repairs or installations but provided no detail on when they occurred or who completed them. Expenses recorded under general infrastructure popped up several times throughout the last few years, but the amounts fluctuated dramatically. Some months reflected minor costs while others showed inexplicably high charges that were never explained in the HOA newsletters or reports. Landscaping costs were another maze of inconsistency, ranging from minimal touch-up fees to substantial sums supposedly covering seasonal enhancements. Though the neighborhood's appearance remained unchanged year after year, these irregularities stacked upon each other like bricks in a wall, each one supporting the possibility that the fee increases were neither random nor accidental. Curiosity shifted into a deeper sense of purpose. The homeowner realized that if he wanted a complete picture, he needed to go beyond public-facing documents. HOAs were required to file certain financial records with the management company that oversaw their operations. While homeowners typically didn't request these materials, they were entitled to access them upon formal inquiry. The homeowner drafted a request for the full budget breakdown of the past 3 years, listing every category he wanted examined: infrastructure, landscaping, administrative costs, contracted services, emergency funds, and miscellaneous spending. Before sending the request, he took a quiet walk around the neighborhood as the sun rose. The quiet felt deceptive. Neat rows of homes stood in their usual order, each one trimmed and painted to the HOA's approved palette. Lawns were maintained with precision, the result of an unspoken competition between some residents and fear-driven compliance from others. Everything looked pristine, yet he now knew that appearance did not equate to organization. The calm exterior masked something fragmented underneath. Walking past the central community area, he paused to examine the sidewalks that did exist. They were old but functional, some cracks, some uneven sections, a few discolorations from weather, but nothing severe enough to justify a major assessment. These sidewalks had existed long before he moved in, and aside from minor wear, they appeared unaltered. If the HOA had been collecting fees for their maintenance, no visible work supported that claim. Even more suspiciously, the financial records he reviewed showed no itemized maintenance logs for sidewalk repairs. He took photos, measurements, and notes, not because he needed them, but because thorough documentation brought structure to the investigation. The more evidence he gathered, the more he understood that this issue extended beyond his own situation. Other homeowners, many of whom likely trusted the HOA without question, were paying for the same invisible repairs and unverified services. The thought troubled him more than expected. If the board was truly mismanaging funds, it was not just an inconvenience but a betrayal of community trust. Once back home, he sent the official budget request, fully aware that the board was legally required to respond. The thought of their reaction, surprise, defensiveness, perhaps even irritation, crossed his mind but did not deter him. He had moved past discomfort and stepped into resolve. The request marked the point of no return, and he accepted that whatever came next would unravel the reality he had grown accustomed to. While waiting for a response, he began speaking casually with neighbors under the guise of regular conversation. He didn't mention his findings outright. Instead, he introduced the topic indirectly, bringing up the fee increase and asking whether anyone had looked closely at the new charges. To his surprise, most neighbors admitted they hadn't noticed the sidewalk assessment at all. They paid the dues automatically, trusting the HOA to handle what they assumed were legitimate expenses. Others had noticed the charge but dismissed it as another routine adjustment. Annoying but manageable, that a few neighbors expressed mild frustration, mentioning that the HOA had raised fees frequently in recent years, though they couldn't recall any corresponding improvements. One neighbor, who lived closer to the central sidewalk area, said that despite paying for maintenance, he hadn't seen a single repair crew in over a decade. Another homeowner whispered that she suspected the board had been funneling money into personal projects after noticing patterns similar to his own findings, though she admitted she never pursued it out of fear of retaliation. This quiet acknowledgement of suspicion reinforced his belief that something larger was at play. The collective silence wasn't due to ignorance but a lack of certainty and support. People didn't question the board because they didn't know where to start or because they feared being singled out. The HOA wielded authority in subtle ways: rule enforcement, violation notices, fines, community shaming, tools that encouraged compliance through pressure rather than agreement. Realizing this deepened his commitment to bring transparency to the situation. 2 days after submitting the budget request, the HOA responded with a short, formal message acknowledging receipt and stating that the documents would be provided within the legally required timeframe. The tone was cold but compliant, a sign that the board had recognized the seriousness of the request. The homeowner saved the message, then settled in to wait. While he waited, he expanded his investigation into the management company overseeing the HOA. Online reviews revealed a pattern of complaints: unexplained charges, inconsistent billing, sudden fee increases, and boards that refused to provide clear documentation. Many households described troubling parallels to what he was experiencing. The possibility that the board and management company were both involved added another layer of complexity. Problems of this scale rarely stemmed from a single decision or a lone actor. They grew through systems that resisted accountability. If this was indeed a coordinated effort, intentional or negligent, uncovering the truth would mean exposing more than just a faulty charge. It would mean revealing structural flaws within an organization that had operated unchecked for years. As the week progressed, the homeowner continued assembling his evidence file, refining it into sections that addressed each inconsistency. By the time the financial documents finally arrived, he was ready. The budget packet appeared polished, formatted with confidence, but beneath the clean presentation lay numbers that confirmed everything he suspected. Categories were inflated without justification, repair projects were listed without dates, and funds were allocated without any explanation of their purpose. The sidewalk maintenance category was the most glaring. The HOA had allocated a substantial annual sum despite performing no repairs and having sidewalks only in limited areas. The overcharges stretched back years, quietly padding budgets with unspent money that disappeared into indistinct spending pools. Now the picture was clear, and now it was time to confront it. The moment he finished analyzing the documents, he realized the next step was unavoidable. He had uncovered enough to bring the issue to the entire community, and to challenge the board openly. The quiet investigation was over. The days following the budget analysis brought a new, sharper awareness to the neighborhood. What once felt like an idyllic community now looked like a landscape of overlooked questions, long-ignored inconsistencies, and silent frustrations. The homeowner had uncovered enough evidence to expose years of financial mismanagement. Yet revealing that truth required a step into the public eye, one that would undoubtedly stir conflict. He understood this, accepted it, and prepared for it. The HOA's next general meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. Historically, these meetings had been poorly attended, with only a handful of residents showing up while the board conducted business with minimal oversight. But this time, something was different. In the days leading up to the meeting, the homeowner spoke discreetly with several neighbors, providing them with pieces of information, not accusations, but facts. He showed them the sidewalk fee discrepancy, the mismatched spending categories, and the long-standing charges for work that had never occurred. The reaction was immediate. Shock turned to anger, confusion to determination, and passive acceptance to a growing sense of collective grievance. By the night of the meeting, word had spread farther than he anticipated. Cars lined the community center parking lot, and residents filtered inside with an energy that felt both tense and anticipatory. Some arrived clutching printouts of the fees. Others simply came because they had heard enough whispers to know something wasn't right. The room filled quickly, and for the first time in the neighborhood's recent history, the homeowners outnumbered the board members by a wide margin. The homeowner took a seat among the crowd, holding his meticulously organized folder. He felt no desire to grandstand and no intention of stirring chaos for its own sake. His goal was clarity, truth presented plainly and without embellishment. But truth, he knew, often caused disruption even when delivered gently. When the HOA president began the meeting with the usual scripted agenda, it became immediately clear that the board had not anticipated this level of attendance. Their expressions shifted from routine confidence to visible unease. As they attempted to move through the standard items, murmurs grew among the crowd, and residents exchanged glances heavy with expectation. Finally, the homeowner rose from his seat, stepping forward not with theatrics but with steady resolve. He presented his findings in an orderly progression, beginning with the sidewalk fee and expanding into the broader inconsistencies across the budget. He laid out evidence with calm precision. The lack of sidewalks on his street and others nearby, the absence of repair logs despite years of allocated funds, the unclear spending categories, and the inflated charges that could not be tied to any documented improvements. He handed copies of maps, financial summaries, and line item disparities to the board and distributed duplicates to residents who requested them. As the information spread through the room, the atmosphere transformed. What had begun as curiosity morphed into collective outrage. Homeowners who had quietly paid their dues for years now saw the numbers for what they were. Unexplained charges, untracked expenses, and possible misuse of funds. Some residents shook their heads in disbelief. Others scribbled notes or snapped photos of the documents. A few exchanged looks that suggested this was not the first time they had suspected something was amiss, but until now, they lacked the proof and the voice to confront it. The board attempted to respond, but their explanations rang hollow. They cited administrative errors, miscommunication, outdated records, and misunderstandings in terminology. But the documentation laid out before them contradicted these claims in unmistakable detail. Each attempt to minimize the issue only further weakened their credibility. Residents spoke up, calmly at first, then with increasing firmness, demanding accountability, transparency, and restitution. The homeowner watched as the dynamic shifted. The authority the board had long wielded loosened under the weight of undeniable facts. The meeting stretched late into the night as residents pressed for answers. Calls for audits, elections, and oversight grew louder. The board's composure crumbled, and the truth became inescapable. The HOA had either allowed substantial financial negligence to occur or had been complicit in it. Within a week of the meeting, an emergency vote was held. The majority of residents supported a full independent audit of the HOA's finances. The board, cornered by both legal obligation and public scrutiny, had no choice but to approve it. The audit revealed the full scale of the mismanagement. Funds had been misallocated under general categories with no traceable purpose. Charges collected for specific repairs, including years of sidewalk fees, had gone entirely unspent or redirected without documentation. While the investigation stopped short of labeling the actions fraudulent, it made clear that severe negligence and poor oversight had persisted for years. The fallout was swift. Several board members resigned under pressure, while others were formally removed through community vote. A new temporary committee formed to stabilize operations and oversee corrective actions. Refunds were issued for misbilled categories, including the sidewalk assessments, resulting in substantial reimbursements across the neighborhood. The management company associated with the HOA was placed on probation, and discussions began about replacing them entirely. Through it all, the homeowner who initiated the inquiry remained a steady presence, offering help when needed and stepping back when appropriate. He had no desire to take control of the HOA or become a figurehead. Uncovering the truth had been his objective, and with transparency restored, he preferred to return to the quiet life he had before the ordeal. Still, neighbors frequently approached him with appreciation, acknowledging that without his persistence, the mismanagement might have continued indefinitely. In the months that followed, the community slowly transformed. Meetings became more transparent, documents were made accessible to all residents, and budgets were itemized with unprecedented clarity. The culture of silence faded as homeowners realized that collective awareness protected them far better than blind trust. What once felt like a controlled environment maintained by opaque authority now resembled a neighborhood run by the people who lived in it. The homeowner often thought back to the day he opened that envelope, the single spark that ignited the unraveling of an entire system. It was strange how something so small, so seemingly inconsequential, could reveal so much. A fee for a sidewalk that didn't exist had exposed a series of hidden faults that ultimately reshaped the balance of power within the community. As time passed and life settled back into normal rhythms, the homeowner returned to his daily routines with a quiet satisfaction. The streets looked the same, the homes unchanged, yet the neighborhood felt different, lighter, more honest, and far more aware. He knew that vigilance was the price of fairness, and though he hoped he would never again have to dig through financial documents and maps late into the night, he would not hesitate if the need arose, and so the chapter closed not with bitterness, but with restoration. A single flawed fee had sparked a community awakening, proving that even the most ordinary homeowner could make a profound difference simply by asking the right questions and refusing to ignore the answers.